All right. So, adverse childhood experience and traumatic stress in minoritized youth. Our learning objectives for today is to talk about how history of racism and oppression intersect with adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and kind of talk about that dynamic interplay between those factors for communities of color, and then maybe talk about strategies for radical or racial healing. So thank you for those of you that were in my workshop yesterday. We had a really good time, and we talked about system transformation yesterday. I'm going to be talking today about what you as providers can do in this work. So we know that millions of children each year are exposed to trauma and adversity. Some would say it's one of the most pernicious and prevalent public health issues that we have in the U.S. today. Community and epidemiological studies really kind of estimate somewhere between 25 and 66% of children and adolescents will have at least one traumatic event. Some of the studies by some folks at Duke, like Bill Copeland and others, kind of say that will happen before adolescents turn age 16. There are other studies that look at lifetime prevalence, and somewhere in the ballpark of 90% of individuals will be impacted by trauma and adversity over their lifetime. We know that segments of the population are at higher risk for trauma and adversity, youth with intellectual or developmental disabilities, geographically rural youth who may be struggling with poverty, and youth of color. There are a range of traumatic events. I just put a list up here. You could probably add to the laundry list, but everything from maltreatment to community violence to thinking about immigration-related experience really fall under the rubric of potentially traumatic events. For youth of color, we know that disproportionate rates occur in terms of trauma, abuse, violence, and adverse childhood experiences. I'm assuming y'all know what ACEs are, right? Okay. The research is pretty clear about these elevated rates for youth of color, particularly African American and Latino youth, somewhere in the rate of 33% higher than their white counterparts. There's another study that looked at American Indian, Alaskan Native youth, and that rate was around 36.2% when compared to their white counterparts. So again, youth of color having a range of disproportionalities in the area of trauma and adversity, and that we know that racism and other social determinants of health, poverty, and maybe unemployment and other socioeconomic factors or access factors really kind of exacerbate what we see in terms of outcomes related to those experiences. And we see these disparities, if I had time, across all child serving systems, right? So yesterday we talked about child welfare and the disproportionalities there, but similar things we see in terms of juvenile justice. Again, some rates as high as 5 times higher for Black and brown youth than their white counterparts. Same thing we see in schools with regard to suspensions, expulsions, and things of that nature. And then when we come to health access, we know they're the least likely to get the mental health services that are needed. So I wanted to add to the language a little bit and talk about historical trauma or intergenerational trauma. You guys know what that is, right? That cumulative harm that gets passed from one generation to the next. Think about Holocaust survivors, many people think about that. Slavery is another example, Trail of Tears for indigenous populations, and really thinking about what that means, because it means that you yourself don't have to experience it, but if someone in your lineage experienced it, it passes down. Some say it's in your DNA. I don't know. Some say it's the contextual factors that surround you, but it does have an impact. Some examples, we talked about slavery, Trail of Tears. Yesterday in our talk, I gave you a lot more examples, like the impact of redlining on environments and neighborhoods for communities of color, and even like the temperature changes in those neighborhoods that occur. We talked about mass incarceration and the war on drugs and how that's having an impact on children and their families. The other thing that I want to talk about is race-based trauma, or what we call racial trauma. This is really coming out of the theoretical work of Carter and his focus on looking at how instances of discrimination and racial bias and racism impact an individual, much in the way as other traumas would. I think a good example of this is what happened on May 25th, 2020, when much of the world witnessed the brutal killing of George Floyd as he begged for his life. And although I think that impacted a lot of people, I think it hit for people of color a little bit more, in that they could see themselves, their brothers, their uncles, their fathers in that light. And so when we're talking about racism and when we're talking about race-based trauma, I want you to understand the gravity of it. You don't have to experience it yourself. You can witness it and still have those vicarious experiences that we often think about in trauma. Ken Hardy, in his book, Healing the Hidden Wounds of Racial Trauma, said it best. He said, racial oppression is a traumatic form of interpersonal violence, which can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. It is that deep-seated emotional toll that it takes on folks. So at the heart of this is racism, and yesterday we talked a lot about structural and institutional racism, and really thinking about those policies and practices that routinely advantage one group over the other, and really thinking about how this gets embedded in everything we do. Embedded in all our systems, embedded in our decision-making, embedded in the way we do business in America. Just some sources of racial trauma. You guys have heard of microaggressions, right? Those daily insults. I don't know that they're all that small, but they take a toll on the individuals of color. Discrimination and bias of all kinds. Acculturation stress. Vicarious trauma, and as I mentioned, historical trauma. In the world of ACEs, everybody thinks about those 10 ACEs, Vince Felitti and his colleagues at CDC and Kaiser Permanente and all the other places that it showed up, began to look at. And there have been many attempts to expand the conceptualization of ACEs to really understand the role of historical trauma and racial trauma embedded in that, and how that then leads to early death for people of color, explaining things like allostatic load and coping and the burden that is often carried. This graphic that I have on the screen is by a group called RISE, and this is their Racing Aces model. And so one of the things in this model really talks about being trauma-informed, but really also understanding how historical trauma is a big part of understanding what folks are experiencing. My other favorite version of this expansion of ACEs is this one by a group called Paces Connection in Philadelphia. And they do this in a way that has the original 10 ACEs, abuse, exposure to parental substance use in the tree. And embedded in the soil near the roots are things like poverty and racism, unemployment, houselessness, and things of that nature. All those social determinants of health that we really know impact children and families, and really begin to give context to not only their experiences of trauma, but where they are embedded within their families and in their communities. It also gives voice to something that we are seeing increasingly. I know John and others in this room do a lot of work in terms of disaster response, and that really speaks to the climate crisis that we are having, whether it's crazy levels of snow, which I think is happening back in Baltimore right now, or more devastating hurricanes. I think about my colleagues in LA and the wildfires that just can't seem to be quenched, and the detrimental impact it has had to the state. So thinking about the environmental crisis and thinking about some of my work with colleagues at Asper and others that say it's only going to get worse. And people of color are going to really be at the brunt of receiving the impact of those things. So other impacts of trauma that we will quickly talk about. All right, I don't know, John, tell me what's a good place to go hiking here in beautiful Miami or somewhere in Florida. Kat? Come on, Kat. I know there's no mountains, but there's like a little greenery trail, something that alligators won't come out at me, right? All right. So let's just say I'm at this state park, right? And I'm doing my thing. I'm walking, I'm chilling, right? And all of a sudden, I see this. What do you think I would do? I might run. I might scream, right? Try not to kill the sound, people. What else might I do? Back away slowly? Okay. Now, if my mama, who is from West Africa, was here, she'd pull out a machete from her back pocket and chop off the head of the snake. But I am from New York City, and I would get the heck out of Dodge. Although I might freeze for just a second to say, oh no, I'm in trouble, right? Okay. So let's say, I'm on this health kick, I'm trying to lose a few pounds. Kat, I don't want to go back to that place, right? But I go to another place. What's another place I could go? Maybe I'll go to Fort Lauderdale. Anybody from Fort Lauderdale got a nice place I could go walk and hike? Huh? The beach? Not the beach. Look at the scene. Work with me. Huh? U Park? Okay, I'm going to U Park because really that didn't work out so good last time, right? And I see this. What do you think I'm gonna do? You really think I'm gonna keep walking? What do you think I'm gonna do? I'm gonna run? I'm gonna scream? I might freeze? Why? It looks like a snake, right? And in my brain, I'm thinking, danger, danger. My brain's telling me danger. It's a snake, right? And so when kids are exposed to trauma, their brains are telling them all kinds of things. And the kids that I work with are repeatedly exposed to trauma. So what do you think happens in your body when you're exposed to trauma? What starts happening? Your heart starts racing, maybe beating out of your chest. What else? What else happens? Yeah, I might feel shaky or on edge. What else? Oh, I don't sweat, I glisten, right? But I might get a little sweaty. My hands might get a little sweaty. What else? Yeah, my stomach might get in all knots and stuff like that. And so internally, there's all kinds of hormones that are coming down, which are, what are the hormones? Cortisol and adrenaline. Very good. Okay. Okay, y'all can read too. Um, right? And in your body, digestion starts to slow down and things start to kind of, your body gets in a state to really kind of say it needs protection, okay? And in your brain, things start to happen, right? So all this information gets encoded into your brain. Your hippocampus, that thing that looks like a banana on my screen, kind of says, I'm gonna remember that snake that I saw at that first location that Kat told me to go to, right? And then it's gonna tell me what to do and how to prepare myself. And all the sensory information that I can take in, the smells, the visuals, the sounds, maybe things I touch or feel, right? Any taste that might come in during that time, all gets encoded into our brains. And this is the beauty of the human brain and body and the phenomena. But it kind of says to me, I'm here to protect you, right? And I'm here to keep you safe. And when these things come up again where you're in danger, I'm going to turn on an alarm, right? And so if you think of kids that are constantly bombarded with traumas, whether they be family generated, whether they be community generated, whether they be racism or other things, that has a long-term impact on them. And so we really want to understand what's happening to children and adolescents during their time and really kind of think about strategies to remediate those things, right? So luckily, we got lots of great folks in this room across the country who's done lots of great research on like how to deliver interventions that are effective, that might help with all the changes that might happen in your frontal lobe. Why is that important? What's the frontal lobe do? Executive functions, make decisions, right? Help you problem solve. And so when you see a kid in school who may not be given the best behavior, I want you to kind of put on your trauma lenses and say, what might have happened to that child? How can I understand that behavior differently, right? And think about it from that perspective. All right. We know that trauma has a toll. We know that racism has a toll on individuals. And when you combine it, you start seeing things that you probably often see in terms of trauma responses, anxiety, depression, sleep difficulties, and things of that nature. You may even see symptoms of post-traumatic stress or PTSD, right? I think, however, there are other things that come up. Mistrust, hopelessness, feelings of inefficacy, loss of motivation may also be parts of that. And so as we think about our mental health system and things that we can do as providers to really change that, I think one thing we have to be thinking about is barriers to access, and all of these words will be forever stricken from our lexicon if things progress, but we're really thinking about how bias shows up, how it shows up in who gets treatment, who doesn't, how we work on access issues, right? And even the effectiveness of treatments, there's data to show that kids, Black and brown kids who are most in need of services with the highest rates of PTSD, depression, and other things are the least likely to get those services, despite us knowing what works in various communities, right? So really think about how racism, bias, discrimination, and all those things, maybe even stereotypes that we hold may be affecting our services that we provide, our settings that we create for services, and the service systems that are parts of the larger delivery, implementation, and services for our family. Just some other things as we think about manifestations of racism, thinking about this mistrust that I talked about. And Kim did a really nice job yesterday talking about treatment engagement and really talking about developing relationships and her reach model. But just think about that example she gave us yesterday, right? Where that connection with the provider was not so good. That flavors our clients' experiences, and then when they go on to another treatment provider, they bring some of that stuff with them. We talked yesterday also about child welfare and some of the biases that exist there. And don't get me wrong, for those of you that are child welfare, the goal of the conversation yesterday was not to bash y'all, but to really think about innovations and strategies to improve all of our service systems. And so really thinking about all of those service systems as a whole and how can we improve that for children and families. Our Surgeon General says we are in a crisis, a mental health crisis right now. And you all know that the need for services is probably the highest it's ever been, and yet we don't have the workforce to meet that demand. I think in addition to kind of the physiological and the psychological impact of trauma, I really think that it leads to, and much of the ACEs work shows this, higher rates of chronicity. And then there have been studies that look at premature death for those that are have the highest rates of exposures. So looking at things like shorter lifespans. So what can we do? How can we begin to dismantle racism and think about strategies to promote radical healing? You may be asking, Ernestine, what is radical healing? I'll tell you. It is a thought process, and it's been very well written about and studied by some of my colleagues in Chicago. But they talk about it as a process that seeks to restore individuals and community to wholeness. So it is thinking about their experiences with racism and oppression and discrimination and the injuries that it causes, right? And thinking about strategies to then repair. And that includes transforming systems. It includes things like truth-telling and acknowledging our past harms, our present harms. It includes addressing our root causes of racism and oppression, and really kind of digging in deep to address it. It has 5 anchors as a model. I'm not going to go into all of that, but I would invite you to look up the work of Comas Diaz, Hector Adames, and Nayeli's name. It'll come to me. It's in my references in the thing. But they have done, and Helen Neville, they have done extensive work in this area. It really builds on, for those of you that know a little bit about liberation psychology or Black psychology, it really builds on some of those early foundational ideas. All right. The other thing that we can do is really adopt a cultural humility framework. And for those of you that may be still thinking about cultural competence, cultural humility is a different framework in that you are not ever going to get to the end point. It is that you are ongoing with your learning, you're ongoing with challenging your cultural biases. It is really, truly a part of trauma-informed care. As part of cultural humility, you have to think about power and power imbalances. So you as a provider are often seen as an expert, right? And the power you bring into the dynamic, and the power you have to advocate for your clients, and the power you can share with them as you partner in treatment. And so really thinking about all the elements of trauma-informed care, which include things like safety and trust and mutuality and transparency and empowerment and cultural responsiveness. They really sit hand in hand. Now, how many of you know of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality? Yes. Okay, good. If you don't, I say Google it. She is an attorney, but she talks about where your identities meet, where being female and Black may kind of intersect, and the real kind of complexity of individuals. This is an intersectional wheel of privilege from a dear friend, Tessa Watkins, who created this. And in it, in the center, is something that I invite you to do, just to sit down and figure out where you are. Where do you have periods of power? Are you white? Are you able-bodied? Are you rich? If you're rich, come and talk to me. Do you drive, right? So, the closer you are to the middle, the closer you are to power. But then look at things like on the outskirts. Are you visibly disabled? Are you poor? Are you houseless or homeless, right? And think about where your intersecting identities show up and where your periods of power show up. So this is a good exercise to really kind of help you examine who you are and maybe how you might show up for the people that you serve. I think another part of radical healing is to really kind of pull in not only what we know by the evidence that works, but also cultural healing practices that might be relevant to the communities that you're working with. So in indigenous healing traditions, it might be storytelling or other ceremonies. I have a group that I'm working with in North Dakota that is doing amazing work in the schools, providing an intervention called Sparks. And they have, with the elders of the community, really adapted that intervention, and we'll be doing a very sacred blanket ceremony for the kids. And so that is important to them and their culture And there is no reason why we can't think about how to meet the needs of our children and families in really culturally responsive ways. Maybe some from the African diaspora, some drumming, some movement, some dance, right? Being part of the healing process, right? So really thinking about how you can bring that cultural healing that might be part of some of the cultures that you serve. I look at Miami and I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so many cultures, there's so many things, there's so many ways that this could be incorporated. So thinking about that. Going back to the metaphor of the tree that we talked about in that ACEs dialogue, hopefully you can see that that's a tree that is in front of her, and really thinking about addressing the root causes of racism. So now, not only acknowledging our privilege and our responsibility, but thinking about ways in which we can move towards equity and equality, redistributing power where it needs to be, making those structural or systemic changes, and most importantly, empowering those impacted by racism, oppression, and other isms that are out there. All right, so yesterday we talked about challenging our implicit biases. I will bring that back to the table because I think that is an important thing that we can do as individuals. There was a young man who was sitting over there. I see you today too. All right, and he was talking about examining our own stuff and looking in the mirror, right? And really talking about what is it that we come with. You know, we all come with biases. It's normal. It's not like you're different, right? It is our brain's way of taking in large amounts of information, right? Making rapid judgments and decisions, right? It frames how we see the world, what we know, how we behave. Now, the good news is with implicit bias, you can challenge it. You can change it, right? If you find something to be not true, you can change that way of thinking. So let's see. I don't know, y'all. I'm going to see. We're going to try a video and see if this works out.
If you think you know what happens next, ask yourself why. These are the Black stories we've been shown. A narrow view that limits our understanding. But there's so much more to see. The full picture of Black life. Let's widen the screen so we can widen our view.
All right. But at the end of the day, I want you to think about your experiences and think about the biases you hold. It was a cute video to kind of help you think about, like, what did you think was going to happen next? And so we'll have that. I think the other thing that we can do, we are such communal people, is to really think about making connections, seeking support. We know that social support is one of the most effective ways in treating trauma. And I think we saw lots of this during the pandemic, people reaching out and taking care of each other, whether it was a funny meme or a chat or just a phone call or a long text to do that. And really thinking about how do you make those social connections? How do you build those relationships? The work that I do is often very exhausting, frustrating, but having a team of folks that I work with that just make me smile every day and remind me the importance of the work is important. So find your people, find those that will uplift you and hold you and support you, and be a support to someone else. All right. How many in this room know about the NAP ministry? All right, this is another thing y'all could Google, as my husband says, put it in the Google machine. Look up the NAP ministry. It is about relaxing, resetting, pausing, and taking care of yourself, right? What's the thing they say when you get on the airplane? If the mask comes down, put on your mask before you put on someone else's, right? And so really thinking about strategies to do some of that. There's some great resources through the NCTSN, www.nctsn.org, lots of free things that you can go. But there's this thing that my colleagues and I created called Pause, Reset, and Nourish. It's got the acronym of PRN, which means as needed, for those of you that love Latin. And in it are strategies that you can use no matter how much time you have to just take a breath, take a beat, collect your thoughts, and pour back into yourself. So there's really great strategies there. For those of you that are mental health providers, this is an older thing, but it's still relevant, it still hits, called Taking Care of Yourself. You can look at something like that. And in it, it's just a whole bunch of ideas that you can just take on and do, just again, to pause and take care of yourself. For those of you that are supervisors and are holding others, there's another great resource on trauma-informed supervision that I would highly recommend that fits in this category nicely. And it's really about reflective supervision, but also holding your providers in a way that helps them not only grow, but also to heal and to do this very difficult work. My friend said, keep hope alive. And we must adopt radical hope. Now, radical hope is a little different than just generic hope in that it is this belief that we have some level of agency to change things for the better, right? As frustrating, as challenging, as chaotic building as some of the last several days have been for many of us, with all the rapid changes in what we know, I think radical hope occurs when you don't really know the future, but you got an idea that things are going to get better. It's not just being blindly optimistic, because you got to put a little work behind it. You got to do some things to make that change happen. And so that's what radical hope is. All right, recognizing resilience. I will say How many of you are psychologists in the room? It's okay, identify yourselves. Yeah, it's okay. We tend to look at the pathology. We tend to look at the deficits. But I'm gonna encourage you to look at the strengths of the families that you work with. They are more than the traumatic event that brought them in the door. They are more than the diagnosis that they have. There is lots within them, within their families, within their communities, and I want you to really be able to use that and pull that in to the work that you do. There is this notion of storytelling that is part of the cultural traditions of so many. There's a professor by the name of Dr. Derek Wilson, and he talks about the power of storytelling, the healing power of storytelling. He describes it as the space where I can speak my questions, express my uncertainty and brokenness, the hurt done to others by me, and the hurt done to me by others. And he talks about storytelling as being an instrument for us to rehumanize ourselves, for us to liberate ourselves. It is just such a great opportunity. There is an African proverb that says, the lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. I want you to marinate on that, right? Think about that. Think about the stories of your children, the families you serve. Think about how that shows up. And maybe how we don't often sit back and listen to those stories. Beyond the trauma narrative, beyond those things, but really listen to understand who they are and how powerful stories can be. There's so many opportunities for us to kind of create space in our healing for storytelling. All right, friends, I am going to wrap up so we can have some time for questions, but I will also invite you to think about ways in which you can cultivate racial pride for those of you that are working with communities of color. Think about things like racial socialization, think about other things that help communities you're serving learn about their history, learn about their people, their families, right? So yesterday, if you were in the session, we did that very special introduction that y'all know about now, right? That tells about, it was a way for you to tell your story, but it's also a way for you to share with others some things that you're proud about. Other ways we can do this is really to commit to social justice. And now more than ever, we probably need to be thinking about strategies to do that. And you don't have to do anything too big. Maybe you're calling someone, maybe you're advocating for someone, maybe you're standing up for someone that doesn't have the power to do that. But just think about ways in which you can become aware, become engaged, and use your voice. There's a great, I don't know what to call it. It's not a toolkit, but it's a set of documents on anti-racist and trauma-informed organizations. And there's the principles, but there are some other things that have come to bear from that document and from years of collaboration within the NCTSN. I invite you to check it out. And think about like what things in your organizations, what things in your own personal practice can you do to really kind of inform the work that you're doing. President Obama said change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we see. So I hope that we take the time to think about all the things that are important to us, all the things that are going on in our country at the moment, all the folks that are most vulnerable and in need, and think about our ability to show up, stand up, and work towards their good. All right, I had one more video. I don't know if it's gonna work. I will try it. I will try. But at the end of the day, I want you to make a choice. I want you to make a choice about who you are, how you show up, what you do for your families, so that you can, as my mama would say, do better. You know better, you do better, so that we can all do better. All right, we'll try it.
All I want with inverted tongue, from whence does fulfillment come? When I expel from this mortal shell, will I die for living up? Though you're someone I can't see, cry to me, and I do.
All right, here's some resources. Again, www.nctsn.org has so many. They also have a learning center if you want some free CEs beyond all the fabulous CEUs you're going to get from this conference, right? You can go on there. And there's some other tools and other things. We didn't talk about assessing racial trauma, but there are some options if you want to use that in your clinical work with families. There's the Yukon Unrest measure that is really good that I highly recommend. Here are all the links that I like and the ones that were not working that you can see. And here is my contact information. Let me open it up for questions and comments. Yes. I could do even one better. I will put it back up for you. So it is, the lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. Because that hunter probably has some fantastic stories about what he did to that lion. Right? Other questions?
Yes, Doctor, you spoke about racial pride and the importance of that. And we know that in the literature that it supports it. But I had an interesting discussion. I came in one day really excited because my favorite tennis player, Madison Keys, won a tennis match that she wasn't expected to win. I came in, I was very excited, very excited. And my teacher, who also happens to be African American, he looked at me, he goes, "Why are you excited that she won?" And he said to me, "Well, because she's black, that's why you're excited." And there were a lot of different reasons, and he kind of criticized that's an old way of thinking. You can't think like that. I mean, and so I'm just curious about what you think of that whole discussion and maybe reiterates the importance of racial pride.
I think he's a pride stature. I think you build racial pride in a lot of different ways, and if it's seeing an athlete of color that you've never seen in a space, gosh, how could we not be transformed by seeing someone like a Serena Williams or Venus Williams or Madison Keys, right? If that's where you find pride, I think that's great. You may find pride in knowing your history and knowing about Frederick Douglass or James Baldwin or others. So wherever it is that you find it, I don't know that there is a bad way to learn it, because it is about learning about your people and your community in different ways. Yeah. I'm curious, what was your response? Or you were a kid? Yeah. Oh, he was very respectful of his teacher. Okay.
Good morning.
Good
Thank you for
morning.
good morning. Thank you for your presentation. This presentation is about trauma, okay? And I wanted to ask the question: how, in your studies of trauma, how do you see the youth impacted by trauma and the misdiagnosis? Because I'm thinking particularly about my culture, the Haitian culture. A lot of the kids that we work for pre-K, and we see a lot of youth that have developmental delay, and yet they've gone to traumatic event of going from Chile, Brazil to the Mexican borders, and sometimes those delays sometimes might be misdiagnosed.
Absolutely.
Not taking into account the trauma that that child at a young age had to survive.
Right.
And what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think a lot of kids are often misdiagnosed. I think about, all right, we'll pick a population, juvenile justice. Do you know that 70 to 85% of kids in juvenile justice have a trauma history? Right? And so what could we do about that? We begin to ask questions about that. I know in the state, I've been in Maryland just a little bit, just not quite 6 months, but I've been in North Carolina for the past 24 years. And what we did there to transform the juvenile justice system, just to understand trauma, was amazing. So now every kid that comes in to the juvenile justice system, they're asking about their trauma history. And we're training judges to be trauma informed and to really think about the decisions that they make and the sentences that they give in the context of understanding trauma and how that might show up in different ways for kids. Yeah. So yes, do I think probably many of them are misdiagnosed? Absolutely. I think there's two layers for me to think about. One is our mental health systems don't always ask kids and families what their experiences are. And sometimes our kids and families are afraid to share that information. I think about right now, I wouldn't be sharing a lot, right? Because it's not going to protect me. So there's that. And then I think there's this cultural thing that may also be in there that we also need to think about. And, you know, trauma is this interesting thing. It's not only the event that happens, it's how I perceive and understand what has happened to me. And that has a cultural lens to it. And so really thinking about that. And then I think the other part in our mental health system is the bias. What are the assumptions we make when a Black kid shows up in our therapy rooms, in our classrooms? I wish I had time. I would show you some data from schools that really looked at how even as early as preschool, teachers have implicit bias about the kids that are going to misbehave in their classroom with no other evidence other than the color of their skin, their race or ethnicity. nothing else, right? I was doing a training for some judges, and I was floored when they told me they know how many jails they will need to build by the time kids of color get to third grade, right? So where are our biases? How do we begin to look at them, examine them, challenge them, disrupt them? Yeah.
Most of us, well, all of us as a population are quite traumatized historically, as well as just day to day in terms of what we're living in. And so, what I find with my population out there is that we're very desensitized. And so, when you do come to try and do this work now with judges and with teachers and the parents, the feedback is, but that's our life, that's our existence. So how much can we make an excuse for that versus how much do we need to push forward? And so I was just wondering in terms of desensitization, and as you're doing like this work with judges, for example, or allowing people to examine their biases and to always be mindful of how trauma is impacting, how do you start to work on this desensitization as well so that we still hold it in mind because it is real and it's so impactful?
Yeah. You know, it's funny. How many of you do trauma work with kids? All right. Let me see if you've had this realization. So you're working with a kid and you're talking about what has happened to them, right? And, you know, for many of our kids, where they are constantly bombarded by trauma and adversity, it is what they see on a daily, right? They think everything is normal, right? And their understanding of things is that it is so normal. This is the way things are. And if you are lucky enough to work with that child and make some progress, they begin to understand that those things are not normal. They are very different. And that's okay, right? We'll teach them the skills to deal with it and all that. But I think when you're in it, when you're in the pool, when you're swimming, it's hard not to get wet, right? Whether you're the provider, whether you're the teacher in the school, whether you're the child who is experiencing all these traumas. And so that's why it's so important to do the work and to create opportunities for healing, right? And why it's so important for those that are providing those services to take a step back and take care of themselves and really focus on their well-being as well. So, are you going to change the whole world? Maybe not, right? But I think you can have an impact. I think you can have those conversations once you start to kind of say, yeah, no, those are horrific things. You shouldn't have had to experience those things, right? And that here's how we're going to teach you to kind of navigate and learn from and cope with your experiences. So, yeah, it's hard. I mean, everybody knows PTSD. What's one of the major signs? Avoidance, right? So it's really hard. But I think it is something that you can intervene on. Good question. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry, y'all. Do you? Okay, there you go. Yes.
So first, I want to just say thank you for the presentation. It was magical, and definitely the healing piece speaks to me. So my comment and/or question is, for those of us that are in the spaces where we are and have been trying to do this work, but you're consistently disregarded, you're if you're excluded, if you are the professional that's going through some of these traumas, even in your work, I'm hoping that you can speak to this. What do you do when you're seeing this and no one's hearing you, no one's listening? You're watching children around you being harmed. You're trying to do your part ethically, and no one's hearing you, but then you're a person who looks like the children. And so is that creating trauma for
Absolutely.
us
Absolutely.
that is consistently seeing this and no one's hearing you? So I'm hoping you can speak to that.
Yeah, it is a double burden, right? Like you may, in and of yourself, be a person from that community that's impacted. So there's that. And then you are the provider, advocate, trying to make a way somehow person to hold that community. It's a lot. It's a lot. Hence the reason why I put in PRN, pause, reflect, and nourish. Hence the reason why I said the NAP ministry, because it is so important to think about your own well-being, because you can't save anybody, you can't help anybody if you yourself are going through and are broken. So I would say, yes, it is the double tax we get to be the double burden that we have as clinicians of color, as leaders, as administrators. There is a lot going on right now, today, that I am fighting, even though I'm on the stage with y'all, but I'm fighting back at home, right? So, yeah, and connect with someone, talk to someone. Don't hold that stuff in, because you're just going to be angry, real angry, and ineffective. So I appreciate you giving voice to that, because we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We have to think about how do we not only take care of our providers as supervisors, but each other as human beings, right, that are going through. So I see you. I see you.
And with that,
right,
we're
good
going to
friends
thank you. Yes,
done.
thank you, Dr. Ernestine Briggs-King.